Ever since South Korea announced to conditionally extend GSOMIA and put a pause on the WTO petition against Japan's export curbs on November 22nd, Seoul and Tokyo are in search of a resolution to find consensus on ways to compensate forced labor victims. The forced labor dispute, which is considered to have ignited the bilateral tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, occurred on October 30th last year. South Korea's Supreme Court had ordered Japanese firms to pay 100 million won as compensation to each of 4 Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor.
주문. 상고를 모두 기각한다. 상고 비용은 피고가 부담한다.
The victims have first filed a lawsuit against the Japanese firms through a court in Japan in 1997, but after losing the case, they have filed the trial in a Korean court in 2005. In 2012, Seoul's top court ruled in favor of the victims, stating that the right of individuals to seek compensation was not invalidated by what Tokyo's court previously had claimed. It took more than 5 years for the ruling to be made since the plaintiffs have filed the lawsuit. Out of the 4 plaintiffs, only 1 has survived to hear the court ruling. Just a month after making the ruling, the Korean Supreme Court ordered Mitsubishi Heavy to compensate 6 Koreans over wartime labor and 5 Korean victims of Japan's wartime sexual slavery on November 29th. Japanese firms, however, are yet to have started compensating the victims, saying all war reparations have been settled through the 1965 treaty between Seoul and Tokyo. In 1965, Korea and Japan signed an accord which states that Korea would give up its rights to seek compensation from Japan for its wartime actions in return for receiving financial benefits and war reparations. Korean law experts are refuting the Japanese company's claims, stressing the 1965 treaty does not invalidate individuals' rights to seek compensation.
강제동원 피해자의 개인 배상 청구권은 소멸되지 않았으며 아직 해결된 것이 아닙니다.
Amid mixed reactions from the people of both countries to the dispute, it has prompted Japan to place export curbs on South Korea. The two sides have finally decided to try narrowing down their differences on the issue after letting the trade war intact for 5 months. South Korea has reached out to Japan for talks by conditionally suspending the expiry of GSOMIA, a military intel sharing pact between the two sides. Amid the exchanges of talks between the two countries' officials on ways to resolve the forced labor issue, South Korea and Japan are slated to hold a bilateral summit later this month.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm Hyun Lee, and I will be filling in for Daniel Che as host of the program this week. Today, we will take a deep dive on the forced labor issue with several experts. To help us dissect this issue into digestible bites, we are joined in the studio today by Kim Byung-ju, Professor of International Studies of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
14 months ago, the Korean Supreme Court made a decision to order Japanese companies to compensate Korean victims of Japanese wartime forced labor. Have the Japanese companies been compensating the victims now?
Not at all, I guess. What happened last year, October 30th, was the ruling being handed down by Korea's High Court, saying that this compensation is necessary. But since then, it's been more than a year, I suppose, and 14 months. Nothing has been happening, in fact. Originally, in terms of the idea of the ruling itself, what was supposed to happen was that either the Japanese companies were supposed to compensate directly by themselves, following the ruling itself, to the victims of forced labor, or if that was not going to happen, a Korean court could actually enforce the forced execution of the ruling itself. What happens is the Korean government could actually take the stocks of Japanese companies operating here in Korea, including, I guess, Nippon Steel, for instance. They can take the stock and then they can actually sell it and then take the cash and then give it to the victims. So that's the, should we call it worst case scenario, let's say? Like a one-sided just execution of the ruling itself. That conceptually it could happen, but it is not happening. I guess in consideration of overall the relationship between the two governments and so on. So to answer your question, yes, absolutely. Nothing has been happening ever since October 30th.
Well, Tokyo has been sticking to its position that essentially they are not responsible for any payments because of the 1965 claims agreement. And so the speaker, Moon Hee-sang, has now made a proposal regarding the possible compensation of the victims.
Right.
And so can you maybe further elaborate on his proposal?
Speaker Moon's idea is, okay, let's not restrict this boundary of these things. Let's open it up. Let's invite contributions from Korean companies, whether they were involved with Japanese companies or not, doesn't matter. And the Japanese side as well, whether they were involved with war crimes or not, just let's invite contributions. And then they call it 1 + 1 + alpha, meaning that there could be other sources. For example, the original idea of Speaker Moon's proposal is even using the funds that are left over from the previous government's creation of this separate fund, like President Park Geun-hye and Park government and then Abe government agreed to create this fund to be used to compensate the victims of the wartime sex slaves. And that fund could be also used as well, in meaning that alpha side. And then nowadays, I guess recently, that idea was set aside. The sex slave side of idea was set aside. And now they're talking about the collecting contributions from all around the world. Anyone who's interested in making a contribution to this fund, this is open. So this is very extremely open concept of fund collection. And then they're going to use it instead of forcing Japanese government, Japanese companies that are allegedly involved with the war crimes past. They're just going to create this fund and then compensate the victims, and then that's the solution. And I guess, so the openness, fund creation based on contribution from anyone around the world, that's the idea of Speaker Moon's proposal itself.
Well, as you're saying, the proposal is something which has been talked about for many, many years now. And we'll see in terms of how it will actually get into effect once it actually takes legs on this side.
Right.
Well, before we extend our discussion specifically about the proposal, we have a clip explaining what the Moon proposal is all about. We'll be back after the video.
It's been 14 months since the South Korean Supreme Court had ordered Japanese firms to compensate victims of wartime forced labor. But not a single penny has been delivered as compensation to the victims yet. Amid the frayed Seoul-Tokyo relations due to the issue, South Korean National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang has come forth with his proposal to resolve the forced labor dispute.
한일 청구권 협정 등과 관련된 모든 피해자들의 배상 문제를 일정한 시한을 정해서 일괄적으로 해결하는 규정을 담아낼 필요가 있다고 생각합니다.
The National Assembly Speaker's proposal is based on establishing a fund contributed by Korean and Japanese firms, public donation and government funds to compensate the victims of the wartime forced labor. It is also dubbed as a 1 + 1 + alpha plan, a comprehensive version of 1 + 1 proposal in which the South Korean government had initially proposed to Japan. What separates Moon's proposal from that of the Korean government is the fact that it includes voluntary contributions from South Korean and Japanese companies and citizens. However, a group of forced labor victims has opposed Moon's proposal, saying it lacks Japan's sincere apology and acknowledgement of their past wrongdoings. The victims also emphasized the proposal should be made after the officials fully communicate with them.
이것은 피해자를 청산하기 위한 법률이다라는 느낌이 들었습니다. 한국과 일본 사이에서의 외교적 갈등을 만들 수 있는 여지가 있는 사람들을 이 재단을 통해서 2억 원씩 받고 화해해서 더 이상 아무런 법적 권리를 행사하지 말라.
In response to the proposal, Japan's ruling party has welcomed the idea, saying that it is a plausible solution that could be discussed and deliberated. The Japanese government, however, hasn't addressed any remarks regarding the proposal and seem to be taking a wait-and-see approach on how the situation transpires in Korea. After going through a 5-month diplomatic stalemate, South Korea and Japan have to work their ways to resolve the forced labor dispute in a way the victims want to ultimately mend their ties.
So the National Assembly Speaker has made this proposal that will include potentially contributions from both governments, both companies, as well as Korean side and the other side, as well as maybe the public worldwide. So I was wondering, Professor, could you comment on where do you think this is coming from and maybe give your own thoughts about what you think the proposal is like?
Right. As mentioned, this is not originally entirely Speaker Moon's idea. You know, the idea has been built around for months and years, indeed, by the experts. And the original source, the way I see it, can be found in German case. In German case, Germany, the country itself, went through a very similar kind of experience, let's say around like on the end of 1980s, for instance. The forced labor, they had forced labor in Germany as well during the World War II. And these people came to the court asking for compensation by the German companies that were involved in the war efforts during the World War II. And these German companies' names include Daimler, Chrysler, Benz, and Siemens, Volkswagen, even Bayer. All these companies, all big name, many of the big name German companies were actually involved. And German people were very scared because this is the case where the monetary compensation, the size could just go tremendously expanding in a way. So they didn't know where this was going to stop. So they came up with the idea of so-called creation of EVZ fund. I think the EVZ stands for German words for memory, responsibility, and future. So they said, let's create this fund from contribution from all these players, including those companies that I mentioned, and also other companies as well, and also other citizens as well. So they create this very large fund to compensate the people. I think overall, as many as 6,500 entities joined to create this fund, and the size of this fund itself was about 10 billion mark at that time. In Korean calculation, I think it's about 8 trillion won. So that's a huge fund. And they actually use this fund to make compensation for the victims, the self-claimed victims in not only Germany, but in countries like Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, and Russia, and so on. And they ended up spending about 6 trillion won at that time out of this fund. So that was a very famous case. And I think the idea originally largely came from that German experience.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the German experience. Of course, there's some parallels, as you mentioned. But in this case, it seems like the Korean public, and particularly the victims, are opposed to this proposal that's been made by the speaker. So could you maybe comment on why you think maybe the victims are not in favor of such an idea?
Korean victims not happy? Of course, this happens all the time. Everybody wants solutions their own way. Victims, our hearts go out for them all the way, and including mine as well. But victims have their own positions. Japanese companies have their own positions. So the idea being proposed by the people like Speaker Moon of the Korean National Assembly, the idea is being proposed as a centrist way or a way that sits somewhere in between two opposite cases. So that's why victims are saying that they're opposing the idea. Their idea is basically more than money, they need sincere apology and recognition of the wrongdoings of the Japanese companies. And of course, in Japan, the companies have their own different kind of perspective. I don't want to get into Japanese perspective on this, but what we know and what we do understand is how Japanese companies of our time right now, as we speak, they see the memory itself is quite different from how victims in Korea sees the memory of that particular past.
Right, and this victim-centered approach, which this government is advocating for, is of course more complicated given the geopolitical circumstances of the crisis.
Right.
Well, I think we'll have to table this discussion for now, but now we'll hear from an expert who will tell us the Japanese view of the proposal. And so we have Stephen Nagy, professor of the International Christian University in Japan, joining us via Skype. Welcome to our program.
Hello from Tokyo. It's good to be with you again.
Thanks for being with us. The Korean National Assembly Speaker Moon Hee-sang has proposed a bill to create a foundation funded by companies and the governments of the citizens of Korea and Japan to compensate Korean victims of Japanese wartime forced labor. How has Tokyo reacted to this proposal?
At this particular stage, I think it's a little bit too early to see how Tokyo is going to respond in the mid to long term to the proposal to really to recruit Japanese and Korean firms and government organizations to create a fund to compensate wartime laborers. But that being said, I think that the proposal is creative and it's creating a window of opportunity to solve this issue and to depoliticize South Korean-Japan relations. Going forward, I think that it's important that from Tokyo's standpoint that whatever initiative does come into fruition, that there'll be mechanisms to ensure that they can't be backtracked. And that's really important, I think, from the Japanese side. When they view agreements with the South Korean government, they view it through the lens of a politicized relationship that has backtracked from important agreements, in particular the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement, but also there's a real strong sentiment in Tokyo that the current government has really politicized the relationships and put the 1965 Normalization Treaty at risk.
Despite signs of bilateral ties gradually thawing between Korea and Japan, tensions could rise once again if Japanese firms are compelled to sell their Korean assets as early as next spring. Is there any way the two sides can resolve the dispute before this happens?
South Korean-Japan relations are, at this particular time, I think that they're in a holding state. The past few years have been very difficult for both states. I think in Tokyo's point of view that the fundamental pillars of bilateral relations, that's military cooperation, political dialogue, and citizen exchanges, and also those business exchanges have been damaged by the politicization of issues within both countries. I think that the removal of South Korea from the white list has further impacted relations in a negative way. At this stage, though, I think South Korea's decision to not let the GSOMIA agreement expire is a good step forward. I think the decision of South Korea to send their prime minister to the enthronement ceremony demonstrated a respect for Japanese traditions and a depoliticization of an important cultural institution. And I think that has been taken well. But both parties need to do a lot of work moving forward to bridge the divide that exists between the two states. And that's not only at the government level. There's a lot of work to be done at the grassroots level and amongst young people to get a better understanding of each other and really understand the long-term challenges in the region, which are economic, social economic inequality, of course North Korea with its nuclear weapons, and of course the long-term challenge of how to manage the China rise. And China's rise is going to be really something that affects both nations, and they're going to need to work together to ensure that the region remains peaceful, remains prosperous, and remains stable. And that stability will require their cooperation, but also cooperation with the United States.
Thank you for your time and expertise on the matter. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to share thoughts with you on South Korea and Japan relations. I look forward to talking to you again.
Well, coming back to you, Professor, if now push comes to shove and the Korean courts now actually follow through and order the Japanese firms to sell their assets here in Korea, certainly diplomatic tensions will rise. So what is your sense of how this issue can be resolved between the two sides? Or do you think this will be resolved at some point?
Because of that particular consideration of the legal procedure process, which no one really has as much control over, everybody is very much concerned, including myself. And that particular action of victims forcing the court to actually sell those stocks of Japanese companies here in Korea and then made them into cash and have them paid to them, that kind of action could actually create the whole situation in the worst case, push the whole situation into the worst case scenario. So that's what we have to avoid. So for that, we need the solution or agreement from both sides involving the victims on one hand and then Japanese companies at this point.
As you know, the Korea and Japan are slated to hold a summit very soon, as well as a series of high-level meetings. So do you think that by the time that the summit happens, do you think Japan and Korea will be able to mend their ties?
Not immediately, I don't think so. I think it will be more gradual approach altogether. And we just had a division heads meetings between the two governments, ministries in charge of industry affairs. And then I think the Director General level meeting has happened in Vienna. And as you said, after that, what we're looking at is a summit between Japan and Korea. The date is not fully set, but many observers believe it will be somewhere around Christmas Eve, I guess. In China, when we have this trilateral meeting of China, Japan, and Korea together. And in that summit, at that occasion of the summit, the expectation is pretty high. But the thing is, Japan has chosen a more gradual approach to this, and they say, we have our regulations, rules, and so since we have announced the white list for export control, we have to go through the proper process to unlock it in a way. So I think what we can see probably at the time of the Korea-Japan summit, if materialized around the time of Christmas or right before then, would be some kind of declaration or presentation of the future path about how the two countries will continue to resolve its differences. But it will be very, very important because so far what we have seen was deterioration of the relationship between the two governments until up to Seoul's declaration that it's going to cease cancellation of GSOMIA. So since then we've been hoping for some kind of upturn, and I guess the summit itself will be the first clear step showing us that the upturn is indeed coming in our way.
So not quite maybe complete mending the ties, but at least momentum in that direction.
Yes.
Well, Professor, we'll have to table our discussion for a moment now. And so now we'll have our second Skype session of the day with an American expert. We are connected with Greg Brzezinski, Professor of History and International Affairs at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, South Korea and Japan are set to hold bilateral summit in China. What can we expect to see from the upcoming meeting?
Right, I think there's a couple of things that I'm paying attention to with this upcoming summit. First of all, what role will China play? And I think that's an interesting question now because the United States has clearly abdicated its role as a leader in Asia. So you might see China to some degree trying to step in and fill the gap a little bit. If it does, it will boost China's prestige at the expense of the United States. Second, obviously, everybody's going to be watching in terms of whether there's progress made on the disagreements between South Korea and Japan. And I think there have been some positive signs in that leaders on both sides have said some conciliatory things, and both of them seem to want to work towards a resolution of the economic issues. But there's also been some discouraging signs. And I think for me, the most discouraging sign is when Tokyo says, well, South Korea still needs to accept Japan's definition of the 1965 treaty. And until it accepts that, there can't be any resolution to the economic disputes. And I think if Japan takes that stance during the summit, it's going to be difficult to make progress. So I hope that Japan will give ground, but right now I'm not completely optimistic about it.
The dispute between the two countries has persisted over a very long period. In your opinion, how should this be resolved?
Right. Well, I think there needs to be three things for the resolution of the dispute. I think the first two might be easier than the third. The first is that South Korea needs to agree not to withdraw from GSOMIA. But I think in exchange for that, it's very important that Japan agree immediately to end the export curbs and sanctions that it's put on South Korea. I think that when Moon Jae-in decided not to withdraw from GSOMIA last week, Japan should have immediately lifted the export curbs, but it hasn't. And I think that reflects badly on Japan's leadership. But I think those two things should have to happen first. Then I think you need the two countries to sit down and have some kind of consultative organization that talks about how to resolve the historical issues fairly and permanently. And I think that's something that we, how you would arrange that, what the logistics of that would be, that needs to be worked out carefully between the two sides. But I think until you have that, until you have a more meaningful resolution of the historical disputes, then there's always going to be the potential for more disagreements between the two countries and more friction.
Professor Brzezinski, thank you for your time and insights today.
All right. Take care. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you for being with us. Now, Professor, we've heard from different experts about this issue, and you've made your own comments and insights on this. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about, maybe wrapping up now, what you think should be the focus now for the two sides?
For two sides, I guess I like to say more on the Korean side, if we can. I think we need to keep in mind two things. Number one, national interest. We do understand, and observers around the world also agree, that this situation has happened because of domestic politics. Japanese domestic politics as well as Korean domestic politics. So politicians have their own interests. Abe, for one, and other politicians here in Korea also have their own interest. But what we have to do is we have to rise above political interests of the factions, including Japan, including Korea, all of us together. And we have to focus on national interest. What do we need as a country here in Korea? I think that's what we have to focus on, and try to set aside things that's coming from domestic political calculations, both Abe's side and then our side. I think we have to be, we have to make an extra effort not to be misled by these domestic political calculations. That's point number one. Number two is, I think for Korean professionals, Korean experts, we need greater professional integrity and courage to explain how Japanese mind work so that we can create better mutual understanding. While the public has all of their rights to raise whatever the voice that they have in mind, but at least professionals, experts, I think we should have a greater courage, greater integrity to explain, look, this is how Japanese think. Whether it's right or wrong, that's how things are done, how minds are made up there. So we have every reason to understand them better so that we can come up with a better strategy, more productive stance in dealing with the relationship. So for that, I think Korean experts, Korean professionals need greater courage to speak their mind and be more forthcoming in terms of explaining what they know to the Korean public.
Right, and I think it's probably a more forward-looking approach with respect to what the domestic policymakers are going to look forward to in the future.
Right.
Well, it looks like we have to let you go, Professor, but thank you for joining us today, and we thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
It took 21 years for the South Korean courts to rule in favor of the Korean victims of forced labor. More than a year has passed since the Korean Supreme Court made its judgment, and the victims have yet to receive an apology from Japan from the past 22 years. The forced labor dispute is what has brought tensions to South Korea-Japan relations. We hope the two sides can resolve the issue through positive and constructive dialogue. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.